قال المؤلف رحمه الله, the author said, may Allah have mercy on him, فائدة, benefit. اشترط قليل من المنتسبين إلى أهل السنة التواتر في الخبر للاحتجاج به في الاعتقاديات. Few who were affiliated with the people of the prophetic way have made successive mass narration a condition for news to be evidence in creedal matters as opposed to evidence in rules or evidence for tafsir of Quran, for example. Kal-Amidi, like Al-Amidi, he deems that a hadith has to be mutawatir to be evidence in the creed. وَلَا عِبْرَةَ بِمَا يَنْفَرِدُ بِهِ, and no regard is given to what he uniquely arrived at. This unique opinion of his has no regard. That means the evidence for the creed doesn't have to be that high. واشترط الخطابي المشهور للاحتجاج في أمور العقائد دون الآحاد. And Al-Khattabi made a condition to be evidence in the matters of the creed that the report would be a popular report, a famous report. Mashhur. Mashhur means at least 3 narrators report this report at every level. Dun al-ahad, not less than that. وبهذا قال علماء المذهب الحنفي, and this is the position taken by the scholars of the Hanafi school. فهذان يحتج بهما, so these two, Al-Khattabi and the Hanafi scholars, they use as evidence for the creed, فهذان يحتج بهما, so these two, meaning successive mass report and famous report, they are used as evidence in the creed. أي المشهور والمتواتر في العقائد. Those two are used as evidence in the creed. كما يحتج بهما في الأحكام, just as they are also used as evidence in rules. أما ما نزل عنهما فلا يحتج به في العقائد إلا في الأحكام. But whatever is lower than that, less than that, is not used as evidence for creedal matters. It could only be evidence for rules. So what this means is that the matter of the creed being the most important matter, its evidence has to be at the highest level. And the matters of rules, its evidence also has to be strong, but not as strong as evidence for the creed. Yani, according to what we're just mentioning here, if either it's going to be a successive mass report or it's going to be a famous report, and famous again means it's narrated by at least 3 narrators at every level. Then that's what's going to be creed, that's what's going to be evidence for the creed, successive mass report or mashhur. So not less than that, according to this. Then what's narrated by 1 reporter, for example, at every level would not be strong enough. But it is strong enough for the rules. If there were a hadith narrated by a single reporter, A single reporter uniquely narrates a hadith about rules, some rule, and then he transmits that to someone reliable like himself. And the entire chain of narration is reliable narrators, but only one by one. It's not a mashhur report, but it's authentic or even fair. Then the scholars would use it as evidence for rules. But for creed has to be higher than that. The highest levels of authenticity. وَمِنْ أَهْلِ الْحَدِيثِ مَنْ يَحْتَجُّ بِمَا دُونَهُ. And some of the people of hadith use as evidence what is less than that. إِذَا صَحَّ الْحَدِيثُ بِإِسْنَادٍ نَظِيفٍ وَاتُّفِقَ عَلَى تَوْثِيقِ رُوَاتِهِ. When the hadith is authentic with a clean chain of narration, yani authentic narration chain, and all of the narrators in the chain, every single one of them is reliable by agreement. Some said, then this is strong enough. Even if it's only وَلَوْ لَمْ يَرْوِهِ إِلَّا وَاحِدٌ عَنْ وَاحِدٍ. Even if this were not reported but by a single individual from a single individual. However, every individual in the chain is trustworthy by agreement. Then some of the people of hadith said, this is strong enough to be evidence in the creed. Amma khabarul ahad, but when it comes to the news of individuals, kal hadith alladhi yarwihi wahid, like a hadith narrated by a mere individual. فَيَجِبُ الْعَمَلُ بِهِ إِذَا اسْتَوْفَى الشُّرُوطُ. It would be obligatory to apply this hadith if the conditions are fulfilled. To apply it, not to believe in it, yani not to believe the Prophet said those words. It would be obligatory to practice it, so that goes back to rules, not creed. أما من حيث تحقق مضمونه أو عدم تحققه أو عدم تحققه فلا يفيد اليقين. But concerning verification of what this report contains, what it alludes to, and what its contents, concerning the verification of the contents of this hadith, or what it alludes to, or the lack of its verification. We're talking about a hadith narrated by an individual. فَلَا يُفِيدُ الْيَقِينَ. Such a hadith doesn't promote certainty. فالأحاديث التي وردت في الطهارة والصلاة والصيام والزكاة. And so the hadiths that were narrated about purification, prayer, fasting, and zakah, وَنَحْوُ ذَلِكَ, and etc. إِذَا صَحَّ إِسْنَادُهَا يَجِبُ الْعَمَلُ بِهَا. Whenever the chain of such a hadith is authentic, then applying it, working according to it, practicing it, taking by the rule that it has, would be obligatory. لكن من حيث إن الرسول قالها أو لم يقلها. But from the perspective that the messenger said it or didn't say it, فليست قطعية. This is not definitive. Whenever we have a hadith that's narrated the way we're describing here. One trustworthy individual from another, with a successive chain of trustworthy individuals. Just one at each level, though. Then this doesn't promote definitiveness and certainty about whether the Prophet said such a hadith or not. أما الحديث المتواتر, but when it comes to a successive mass report, والمشهور, and a famous report, فإنهما يفيدان العلم القطعي اليقيني. Those two, they do promote definitive knowledge. Not the same kind of knowledge, though, as you should know by now. Mutawatir promotes necessary knowledge, and mashhur promotes inferred knowledge for an expert in particular. Tambih, notice. قال الشيخ شرف الدين التلمساني في شرح لمع الأدلة. Shaykh Sharafuddin at-Tilimsani said in the explanation of Luma'ul Adillah, Ma Nassuhu, quotes, Inna shar'a innama thabata bil-aql. Indeed, the sacred law is confirmed by the intellect. It's confirmed by the intellect. For Wahhabi, that statement right there is wrong. It's repulsive. And this statement doesn't mean the sacred law is based on the intellect. It doesn't mean the sacred law is dependent on the intellect. No. The sacred law is confirmed by the intellect. That means the intellect verifies it, not that it has any superiority over it or authority over it. فلا يتصور وروده بما يكذب العقل. And so it is inconceivable that sacred law would come with something that's contrary to the intellect. So that's why it's not acceptable to an intellectual that Jesus is God and the Son of God, or that 1 and 3 are the same. That's why so many Christians are conflicted, and people of other religions too. Because when they just wanted to think for themselves for a moment, they knew that what they're believing is irrational. 3 and 1 being the same, and the Father and the Son being the same. This should be, this doesn't make sense, so it should be not something that's part of one's religion. So, لا يتصور وروده بما يكذب العقل. It's inconceivable that the sacred law would come with what belies the intellect. Wahhabi doesn't believe that. I saw a recording of a Wahhabi recently saying, Allah is the creator of the laws of logic. What is he trying to get at here? He's trying to say, if Allah revealed something that's completely irrational, then so be it. Ahlul Sunnah says, nothing in the sacred law is irrational. فَإِنَّهُ شَاهِدُ. Indeed, the mind is the witness, is its witness, is the sacred law's witness. فَلَوْ أَتَى بِذَلِكَ لَبَطَلَ الشَّرْعُ وَالْعَقْلُ مَعًا. So, had the sacred law come with such a thing, with something contrary to the intellect, then the sacred law itself would be debunked, and the intellect too would be debunked. Because it's impossible that the sacred law would be contrary to the sound mind. And if it's possible, the sacred law would be contrary to the sound mind. If that's possible, it means then the sound mind is unreliable because the sacred law has to be reliable. If it's possible that the sacred law would contradict the intellect, then by virtue of contradicting the intellect, it would be unreliable. And the intellect, by virtue of contradicting the sacred law, would be unreliable because sacred law must be true. Like we already said, news from God must be true. فَإِذَا تَقَرَّرَ هَذَا. So if that's settled, فَنَقُول, we therefore say, كل لفظ يرد من الشرع في الذات والأسماء والصفات. Any expression that came in the sacred law about God's self and his names and his attributes. بما يوهم خلاف العقل. Any wording that came in the sacred law in these issues, in these topics, with something that gives the impression, gives an impression that's against the mind. It might cause someone to imagine something that's contrary to sound reasoning. فَلَا يَخْلُو إِمَّا. We talk about the wording, not the true meaning, just the wording. So right now, separate the wording from the meaning. Any wording that came in the sacred law about the self of God or his names or his attributes, and this wording gives the false impression about something that's contrary to the mind. فلا يخلو إما أن يكون متواترا أو آحادا. Then, if we do process of elimination, such wording would either be by successive mass report or a report of individuals. There's no third option here. فإن كان آحادا. Now, if it were a report of individuals, وهو نص, and it's explicit, لا يحتمل التأويل, unaccepting of alternative interpretation or reinterpretation. It's explicit and unaccepting of reinterpretation. قطعنا بتكذيب ناقله. Then we will be definitive about its transmitter. We would be definitive about contradicting its transmitter. We would be in opposition to its transmitter, for sure. We don't accept and we don't agree. Oh, sahwihi, or we'll be sure that he was mistaken. Either he's lying. So I want to ask about this word takdhib here, but I'm going to translate it as per the context. قطعنا بتكذيب ناقله. Then we are sure that its transmitter is a liar. Oh, sahwihi, or he's forgetful about something. Oh, ghalatihi, or he's mistaken. Yani, if we say we're sure that he had sahu, forgetfulness, or ghalat, mistake, then means we're sure he's wrong even if it wasn't malicious. But when he says qata'na bi takdhibihi, we're sure about his lying. That means then that's malicious. So either he's malicious or not. This one who's reporting something, it's not a successive mass report. And it's explicit in something that's contrary to the intellect. Then either its reporter is malicious and he's a liar, or he's not malicious, so he's forgetful, or he's mistaken. وَإِنْ كَانَ ظَاهِرًا, and if this report, the same kind of report, only seems to be contrary to the mind, what appears from it, what stands out from it, what stands out from it is contrary to the mind, فَالظَّاهِرُ مِنْهُ غَيْرُ مُرَادٍ, then what stands out about it is not what's intended. The meaning that stands out is not the one that's intended. We're sure about that. So that's the case there. Right now, we're tackling a report of individuals. And this report of individuals, then either it's explicitly against the mind or it only seems to be against the mind. If it's explicitly against the mind, which means it has no other way of interpretation, then either the reporter of this report is, what was the word I just used? A malicious liar, or he's not malicious and he's forgetful or mistaken. But if it can bear another meaning, then khalas, that meaning that appears, that stands out, is not the intended one, because it's against the mind. That can't be what the sacred law meant. وَإِنْ كَانَ مُتَوَاتِرًا, and if this report were a report of were successive mass report. So could it be a successive mass report? And again, it's against the intellect. At-Tilim Sani says, فَلَا يُتَصَوَّرُ أَنْ يَكُونَ نَصًّا لَا يَحْتَمِلُ التَّأْوِيلِ. It's inconceivable that it would be explicitly against the mind and unaccepting of any alternative interpretation or any reinterpretation. That's impossible. It's not possible to be a successive mass report, because that would mean it's definitively true, and then be explicitly against the sound mind. That's not possible. So what if someone insisted and said, well, but what if it did happen? So the answer here, you stick to your guns. You say, it's not going to happen. It's not possible. It can't happen. You just want to speculate about something that's literally impossible. And no one would be stuck here but someone who does not believe that the sound mind is a means for real knowledge. Or he doesn't believe that successive mass report is a means for real knowledge. One of those or both of those. That's why he's stuck here. But whoever understands the issue, and he knows what the mind is and how it functions, and he knows what successive mass report is, then he knows that it is impossible that a successive mass report would be explicitly against the mind. So he says, فَلَا بُدَّ أَنْ يَكُونَ ظَاهِرًا أَوْ مُحْتَمِلًا. Therefore, there is no alternative but for this successive mass report to merely seem to be against the mind. What stands out from it is against the mind, but it's not limited to what stands out from it. It could bear possible interpretations beyond what stands out from it. Or it's a statement that has more than one meaning without any one of them standing out in particular. Muhtamil. Muhtamil, that's what it means. An example of that is al-fi'l al-mudari'. Al-fi'l al-mudari', the past or present tense verb in Arabic. If you say yadrib, it might mean I hit in the present, or it might mean I will hit in the future. So it's muhtamil. Could be either one of those. So someone might say neither of those is more zahir. This verb that can be for the present or the future, is one of them, the present or the future, more apparent? Does one of them stand out more for such a verb? The answer is no. Al-fi'l al-mudari' is muhtamil. It has more than one meaning equally. Not that it has more than one meaning while one of them stands out more than others. The successive mass report could only at most seem to be against the mind, or just possibly be against, possibly have meanings, ways of interpretation that could be against the mind, but it wouldn't be ever explicitly against the mind. فَحِينَئِذٍ نَقُولُ, so upon that we say, الاحتمال الذي دل العقل على خلافه ليس بمراد منه. The possibility that the mind disproves. The possibility that the mind disproves from this successive mass report is not what's meant by it. فإن بقي بعد إزالته احتمال واحد. So after removing that possible meaning, if only one meaning is left, تعين أنه المراد بحكم الحال. Then it is definitive that that's the meaning of the statement by the fact of the matter. وَإِنْ بَقِيَ احْتِمَالَانِ فَالصَّاعِدَ. But if after excluding the impossibility that the mind disproves, after excluding that, if there's still two or more possible meanings, فَلَا يَخْلُو إِمَّا أَنْ يَدُلَّ قَاطِعٌ عَلَى تَعْيِينِ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا أَوْ لَا. Then it has to be that either there's something definitive that proves one meant meaning, or there is no such definitive thing. فَإِن دَلَّ حُمِلَ عَلَيْهِ. So if there were some definitive thing that proves the intended meaning, then the report would be interpreted according to that. وَإِن لَمْ يَدُلَّ قَاطِعٌ عَلَى التَّعْيِينِ. And if there weren't anything definitive that singles out one of its possible meanings as being the meaning, فَهَلْ يُعَيَّنُ بِالظَّنِّ وَالِاجْتِهَادِ. Then would its meaning be determined by speculation? Educated speculation. I was almost going to say educated guess, but the word guess is too weak here. Educated opinion, or by a determination, ijtihad. If there weren't anything definitive to specify the intended meaning, then would that meaning be sought by ijtihad? اختلف فيه. At-Tilimsani says, there's a difference about this. Whether, meaning, he's saying there's a difference about whether we're going to assign a particular meaning to something or if we're just going to leave it to Allah. He says, فَمَذْهَبُ السَّلَفِ عَدَمُ التَّعْيِينِ. The way of the Salaf is not to specify a particular meaning for such a text. خَشْيَةَ الْإِلْحَادِ فِي الْأَسْمَاءِ وَالصِّفَاتِ. Out of fear of irreligiousness concerning God's names and attributes. Intaha. So that's what he said. Not everything in here Shaykh agrees with. We already know that some of the scholars of the Salaf used to give specific interpretations to statements that could bear more than one interpretation. But that wasn't the overwhelming practice of the old scholars. As for being an overwhelming practice, yani a normal practice, that was for the latter day scholars, when people became more ignorant and the people of misguidance became more widespread and the people's comprehensions deteriorated and the scholars needed to do something to protect the layman. So they explained these verses according to determined, or these religious texts, according to determined interpretations, instead of leaving them without any particular interpretation other than abandoning the literal meaning. That's what some of the Salaf did. So it can't be said they didn't used to do it. And that's what At-Tilimsani is saying. He says, فَمَذْهَبُ السَّلَفِ عَدَمُ تَعْيِينِ خَشْيَةَ الْإِلْحَادِ خَشْيَةَ الْإِلْحَادِ فِي الْأَسْمَاءِ وَالصِّفَاتِ. The way of the Salaf is not to determine, so he left it open. He didn't say sometimes or the like. He gave a blanket statement. The way of the old Salaf is not to give any particular interpretation to these texts. So right there, we don't agree with that. Because, why? Because it doesn't comply with the evidence. So that's his statement. He said, the Salaf didn't used to do it. Now, you might say, maybe that's a general statement of his when he says the Salaf didn't used to do it. And maybe it is, the Shaykh is going to say that, but look what he said right after that. خَشْيَةَ الْإِلْحَادِ. Out of fear of irreligiousness in the names of Allah and His attributes. They refrain from that for fear of irreligiousness. Yani basically blasphemy. So no, that's not the case there. So that's his quote, and his quote is fine all the way up until there, where he says, Yani, he posed the question. He said, so if there's nothing definitive that proves one of its possible meanings, then the question is, would its exact meaning be determined? Would the scholar strive to arrive at that by ijtihad? He says, اختلف فيه. They differed about it. That's true. What's the difference? The real difference. The real difference is that they didn't differ about it concerning their conviction about the permissibility of that. They didn't differ saying it's not permissible. Rather, they just differed about doing it. And it wasn't an absolute difference. Meaning, the majority of the older scholars used to not delve into the meanings of those ambiguous texts. Here you can say a general statement. It's a general one accepting of exclusion. The old scholars didn't used to give specific interpretations for these ambiguous texts. That's a general statement that's accepting of exclusions. And the later scholars, they used to give specific interpretations to these texts. And sometimes the older scholars, the early scholars, would give specific interpretations to such texts. That's their difference about the issue, period. But he said something here that our Shaykh didn't agree with, and he taught us. Our Shaykh taught us why there should not be an agreement to this statement. He says, فَمَذْهَبُ السَّلَفِ عَدَمُ تَعْيِينٍ. The way of the Salaf is not to specify. That's a generality that's accepting of exclusion. But it doesn't look like that's his intent, because he said right after that, خَشْيَةَ الْإِلْحَادِ, out of fear of irreligiousness. فِي الْأَسْمَاءِ وَالصِّفَاتِ, in the names and attributes of God. No, not that far. Yani, ilhad is blasphemy. Usually when they say ilhad, they mean blasphemy. Rather, they were saying, this text can have so many meanings, and some of its meanings, more than one of its meanings, are possible. So if I determine that it's this one, what if it's not that one? What if it's another one? Like what Shaykh taught us about istiwa. He said, the weighty saying, the dominant saying is that istiwa means qahara, subjugation and dominance, conquering. That's the weighty saying. And possibly he would say, this is what it means. It means istiwa, it means qahara. And that's what some scholars say. They say istiwa means qahara. But most accurate statement is what the Shaykh told us in As-Sirat al-Mustaqim, which is to say, istiwa likely means qahara. Most likely means qahara. He says, our Shaykh that is, وَقَوْلُ ابْنِ تِلِمْسَانِي, and what Ibn Tilimsani said, إِنَّ مَذْهَبَ السَّلَفِ عَدَمُ تَعْيِينٍ, that the way of the Salaf is to refrain from specifying a particular meaning. لَعَلَّهُ يُرِيدُ بِذَلِكَ عَدَمَ كَثْرَةِ ذَلِكَ بِالنِّسْبَةِ لِلْخَلَفِ. Maybe what he means by that is what we already said, that they didn't used to do it a lot in comparison to the Khalaf, the latter day ones. Maybe that's what he meant. But he shouldn't mean more than this. He shouldn't mean outright denial. وَإِلَّا فَقَدْ ثَبَتَ عَنِ السَّلَفِ كَمَا ثَبَتَ عَنِ الْخَلَفِ. Because such direct interpretations for these verses and hadiths have been confirmed from some of the Salaf, just like they were confirmed about some of the Khalaf. فَمَنْ نَفَى التَّأْوِيلَ التَّفْصِيلِيَّ عَنِ السَّلَفِ غَالِطٌ. So anyone who denies that the Salaf used to give specific determined interpretations to some ambiguous texts that require explanation, that are susceptible to more than one interpretation. فَمَنْ نَفَى التَّأْوِيلَ التَّفْصِيلِي عَنِ السَّلَفِ. So anyone who negated determined ta'wil, determined, yani specific, non-literal interpretation. فمن نفى وإلا فقد ثبت عن السلف كما ثبت عن الخلف. Just as that was confirmed about the Khalaf, that they gave specific interpretations. فمن نفى التأويل التفصيلي عن السلف غالط. So anyone who denies that the Salaf used to So anyone who negated the determined reinterpretation about the Salaf or from the Salaf, negated that about them, he's mistaken. Ghalit. Shaykh didn't say kafir, he said ghalit. He's wrong. لثبوت ذلك عن أحمد بالإسناد الصحيح, due to the confirmation of that about Imam Ahmad and with the authentic chain of narration. وكذلك ثبت عن الإمام البخاري وغيرهما, and likewise that's confirmed about Imam al-Bukhari and others. Review your lessons in the Sirat, and we should stop there.